Now let's have a discussion related to the concept of a pro and counter cyclical policies. Now to understand this particular idea of a pro and counter cyclical, first you need to understand concept of a business or economic cycle. Generally the representation of a business or economic cycle is done in the form of a sine wave. There are four stages in this particular business cycle. Different books will give you different stages, but basically idea is the first stage, that is from this particular point to this particular point, this is called as boom or expansion stage. Second stage, this particular part of the representation is the slowdown stage. The third stage is the recessionary stage, and the fourth stage is the recovery stage. Now, what is the importance of all of these particular phases in a business cycle? Let's try and understand that first. Now, generally we say that when the GDP is increasing, the GDP growth rate will also keep on increasing from one year to the next year. For example, let's take a very simple number here. Imagine the GDP of a particular country is 100 crore rupees in this year. Next year, this will become 105 crore rupees. A year after this, it will become, let's say, 10 or 112 crore rupees. A year after this will become 125 crore rupees. So have a look at this. The GDP value is increasing, and not just this, the GDP growth rate is also increasing. Is it okay? The GDP, which is basically nothing but the market value of goods and services, it is increasing. Along with this, we are also seeing that the growth rate, GDP growth rate is also increasing. So generally, this particular phase of a business cycle or economic cycle is called as a boom or expansion stage. Now, please understand this. Whenever there is a boom or expansion stage experienced by any economy, what are the outcomes? What you will find generally during this particular stage? One, you will see that the private sector investment is generally higher during this particular phase. The simple reason for this is when the demand for the goods and services is higher, the sales is higher in the market, the private sector will also invest high, produce high during this particular phase. And that is a precise reason why there is a very high GDP increase as well as a GDP growth rate experienced during this particular phase. In addition to this, you will also see that the creation of employment is being done during this particular stage. That is, the growth rate of employment is also higher during this particular stage of the phase of economic cycle. So generally you will find these kind of outcomes in the first phase. And when I say growth is increasing, employment is increasing, can I also simply say that the quality of life of people is expected to increase. Again, I'm saying is expected to increase. The per capita income of this particular economy is expected to increase. Right? So these are generally the outcomes of this particular boom or expansion stage. Second stage is called as a slow down stage. You can see this particular declining trajectory of the cycle here. It is called as the slowdown stage. Now follow this very carefully. Even during slowdown, the GDP is increasing. I repeat the statement. Even during the slowdown, the GDP is increasing. Means what? The total market value of goods and services from one reference period to the next reference period, the value keeps on increasing. But the GDP growth rate keeps on declining like this. Let me give a simple example here. Imagine for a particular country, GDP value currently is, let's say 100 crore rupees for the current year. Next year, it becomes 110 crore rupees. 1 year after this, it will become 115 crore rupees. And year after that, the value of a GDP will increase to 116 crore rupees. Now have a look at the stages here, or have a look at the numbers here. What is happening is the GDP value is increasing. Is it okay? From 100 crore, it has increased to 110, then to 115, then to 116. So the GDP value has increased, no doubt related to this. But if you see the GDP growth rate from this particular year to the next year, the growth rate is 10%. From here to here, the growth rate has fallen down to, let's say, around 4%. From here to here, the growth rate will somewhere be less than, let's say, 1%. Don't worry about the absolute numbers here. Just look at the concept. So what has happened from this particular year to the next year and to the next year, the GDP value has increased. Is it okay? GDP value has increased. but the GDP growth rate has kept on climbing downwards like this. This particular stage in the economy is called as a slowdown stage. And generally during a slowdown stage, what you will see is the investment of the private sector will be much lesser, or the growth rate in the investment will start falling downwards like this. The demand for goods and services, the increase in that will also be declining. The employment generation or the employment growth rate will also start coming downwards at this particular point of time. Now, if the economic growth rate is not controlled at this particular point of time, or the government doesn't come into picture and revive the demand, what happens is the economy will enter into recession here. What is a recession? Please remember the technical definition of a recession here. Generally, we say that any economy which registers a negative growth rate for 2 consecutive quarters is called as the recession. I repeat the definition. This is important here. Generally, when any economy registers a negative growth rate for 2 consecutive quarters, this is called as recession. Now, let me take a simple example and try to explain to you what is the idea of a recession. Let's take the financial year 22 here. In the financial year 22, imagine in the first quarter, the GDP growth rate is minus 5%. Minus 5% generally means what? The GDP value compared to the same quarter in the previous fiscal has actually come down. Is it okay? And in the second quarter, if the GDP growth rate is, let's say, minus 7%. So what has happened? The GDP growth rate is in negative terms. And the technical term that they use for this is a contraction in the GDP. So understand this. Whenever any economy for 2 consecutive quarters registers a negative growth rate like this is called as a recession. This particular stage is called as a recession. For example, if you take the Indian case itself, in the financial year 21, for the first quarter as well as for the second quarter, Indian economy registered a negative growth rate. And this basically is nothing but the concept of a recession itself. Now, what generally you find during the recession? During recession, you generally see that the growth rate is negative. In addition to this, the private sector investment will be very, very low. The private sector investment will take a dip. And not just this, the employment growth rate will be very, very low. Rather than having employment growth rate at this particular point of time, generally what you see is unemployment growth rate will start picking upwards. The incomes of the households are affected. Generally, these are the outcomes during the recession. And finally, in the recovery stage, this is the fourth stage. The upward swing that the curve will take like this is basically nothing but the recovery stage itself. In the recovery stage, what you generally see is the economy will start moving from very high negatives towards a zero or a positive growth rate in the GDP. This is generally what is seen in the recovery stage. I'll repeat the statement here. In the recovery stage, from the recessionary stage, where the GDP growth rate is very, very high, negative as such, or in the negative, the economy will start registering, or the GDP growth rate of the economy will start moving towards the positive growth rate. This particular stage is called as a recovery stage. Generally, during recovery stage, the investment in the economy, either because of the private sector or because of the government, will start increasing. From very high unemployment rate, will start experiencing certain growth rate in the employment, and there will be increased household income observed during this particular phase also. So generally, these are the 4 stages in the business or economic cycle. Now, apart from this, if you are reading the newspapers or somewhere, you would have come across another term called as a depression. There is another term called as a depression. Now, what happens is whenever economy is in recession, generally what we expect is that the government will come into action, government will increase the expenditure, government will revive the growth rate. Right? If that does not happen, or even if the government does try to do this and the economic growth rate still registers a very high negative growth rates as such, or registers a very high negative, or in simple terms, a severe recession is called as depression. Is it okay? Right? Recession is what? For 2 consecutive quarters, economy will register a negative growth rate. Okay. For example, quarter 1 minus 5%, quarter 2 minus 7%. Now, what we expect at this particular point of time is government will swing into action. Government will revive the demand. Government will spend more in the market. Government will invest in the market so as to ensure that the economy will start experiencing a recovery. Now, despite all of these particular measures, what if the economy further slides into recession? More recession will be experienced from 5% 7%. Imagine the GDP registered will be minus 23%, minus 48%, minus 72%. If the slide continues like this is called as a depression, or a severe recession is called as a depression. Please understand this. The last depression that the global economy experienced was back in the year 1929, 1930. In the last 2 or 3 decades, yes, we have experienced a recession here and there, but we have not yet come across a very big global economic scale depression as such. Okay, so this is a basic understanding of a business cycle or economic cycle. Now, having understood this, understand the next logical argument here. What is this particular idea of a pro and counter cyclical policies? Now, just to understand this, first and foremost, you will have to remember what we have discussed in the previous slide. We have experienced an economic cycle or a business cycle. That is, in the first stage, what do you see? There is a boom. Second stage, there is a slowdown. Third stage, there is a recession. And in the fourth stage, there is a recovery. Now, when the economy will be experiencing either a boom, slowdown, recession, or recovery, what is the role of the government? I'll use a term fiscal policy here. Generally, you will come across two terms. One is called as a fiscal policy, and the other one is called as a monetary policy. Again, there are different types of policies, but you look at overall economy, two policies are very, very important. One is fiscal policy, and the second one is the monetary policy. What is the basic idea of both of them? Fiscal policy is framed by the government. Is it okay? Fiscal policy is formed by whom? Government. In case of India, who frames the fiscal policy? Government of India will frame the fiscal policy. Now, what do you mean by fiscal policy here? Fiscal policy generally refers to all those particular policies of the government which deals with the financials. Is it okay? Fiscal policy refers to all the guidelines or the policy measures which have been taken by the government which are dealing with the financials of the economy. For example, budget is a part of the fiscal policy. Taxation is a part of the fiscal policy. Disinvestment policy is a part of the fiscal policy. And we will discuss all of them individually under respective chapters. So one policy is what? A fiscal policy, and the other policy is a monetary policy. And this particular monetary policy is the purview of Central Banker of India. Central Banker of India is a Reserve Bank of India. So Reserve Bank of India forms a monetary policy using which either it will increase the money supply in the system or decrease the money supply in the system. Basic understanding. Later under RBI, we will discuss all the important tools which RBI will use under the monetary policy. Is it okay? So there are two very important policies, fiscal policy and monetary policy. Now understand this, whenever the economy is experiencing either the growth, that is a boom, or a recession, slowdown or recovery, what is the role of the government there? How does the government formulate a policy? These particular policies are generally referred to as either pro-cyclical policy or counter-cyclical policy. I'll repeat it. How the government formulates a policy at this particular point of time. That is when there's a slowdown, when there is a recession, when there is a recovery, when there is a boom. What is the orientation of the government policies? How they are going to implement? What is going to the impact of this particular policy on this particular cycle? This basically is characterized either as a pro-cyclical policy or a counter-cyclical policy. Now, what is the importance of this? Let's try and understand this first. What we expect is whenever there is a boom like this, what we expect is a private sector investment generally will invest very high in the economy. Why? Whenever there is a boom like this, I said that the demand for goods and services generally is increasing during this particular phase of the cycle. So overall or aggregate demand for goods and services in the market is higher. So when the demand for goods and services is higher, generally what do you think will the private sector do at this particular point of time? If the demand for their goods and services is higher, private sector will invest more, private sector will employ more, private sector will produce more goods and services so that they will supply more to the market and generate more and more profit. And always remember this, private sector will always keep running behind profits. They always want more and more profit. You cannot attribute the same with respect to the government of India owned entities. In case of government of India owned entities, yes, they also want to make profit, but they are also worried about social welfare. Whereas in case of private sector entities, social welfare is very low importance to them, whereas profit making is a very high priority for them. So understand this, when the demand for goods and services is very high in the market or keeps on increasing in the market, you can always expect that the private sector will invest more, produce more, employ more, want to earn more and more profit. But there is a problem with respect to this also. What is the problem? Understand this. At this particular point of time, understand this. What if government of India also increases its expenditure? Is it okay? I'm taking one phase here. What is the phase? I'm taking a boom phase here. In boom phase, what I said was the private sector is already investing more and more in the market. Now, at this particular point of time, what if the government of India's policy, that is basically fiscal policy, also follows a concept of expansionary fiscal policy? Now, there are two terms. We'll come back to the discussion. There are two terms here. One is called as an expansionary fiscal policy, and the second one is called as a contractionary fiscal policy. What is the idea here? Whenever I say expansionary fiscal policy, it simply means government is spending more and more in the market. Is it okay? Through different modes or different types of expenditures, government is spending more and more in the market. So whenever government spends more, such type of fiscal policy is called as expansionary fiscal policy. Whereas if I look at the counter side of it or opposite side of it, this is called as a contractionary fiscal policy. And whenever I say contractionary fiscal policy, government's expenditure will start shrinking like this. Government will spend lesser and lesser. That is the idea of a contractionary fiscal policy. So understand this. Within this particular business cycle, I am taking one stage. That is stage is nothing but boom. During this particular boom stage, already the private sector investment is very high. Now, what if the government also increases the expenditure at this particular point of time? This particular boom phase will further increase like this, or the GDP growth rate will start increasing at a much faster pace. And this particular point of time, there is a concern or there is a danger that there could be a very high inflation rate in the system. So remember this. This could lead to very high inflation rate in the system. And there is another concern with respect to this kind of a policy also. Another reason for concern is whenever government of India spends more like this. Is it okay? Whenever government of India spending more, it generally means that its expenditure increases and leads to higher public debt. Now you will have a doubt, sir, what do you mean by public debt here? Regarding the concept of a public debt, we'll discuss this separately when I take fiscal policy discussion. But more importantly, understand right now here, public debt basically means the overall money that the government needs to repay. Is it okay? The overall money that the government needs to repay. Government will borrow from different stakeholders, different participants in the market. Why does government borrow? Generally, it is seen that the government's expenditure is higher than the government's revenue. Is it okay? Government's expenditure is higher than government's revenue. And if a government of India collects lesser taxes at this particular point of time, lesser taxes by reducing the tax rate. Is it okay? So understand this, during a boom phase, two things are happening. Government of India is spending more, government of India is reducing the tax rate. The logic for the government is very simple. By spending more and reducing the tax rate, I'm promoting more growth rate in the economy. And generally more growth is associated with more incomes, is associated with more production of goods and services, more earning of the households, more employment generation. So government of India says by spending more at this particular stage and by reducing the tax rate, I'm promoting growth rate. Yes, that will happen. But after a certain period of time, this will basically lead to one, inflationary trend in the market, and second, increasing public debt of the government. That is, inflation, as of now, simply understand this. Whenever the price levels for basket of commodities will increase, this is called as inflation. I'll repeat the definition here. Whenever for a basket of commodities we start paying more and more money, this is called as inflation. For example, imagine in 2021 there is a basket of goods and services, and this will cost you, let's say, 100 rupees. Just a hypothetical understanding here. For the same basket of commodities in the next year, if you are paying, let's say, 110 rupees, so the price level for the basket of commodities has increased. And when the price levels will increase like this is called as inflation. As of now, simply understand this, because inflation is one of the very important modules, and we'll discuss this separately. So understand this. During boom, when government spends more, one, the inflation is expected to be very high, because government is spending more money is there in the system. The people will have more money to purchase goods and services, so demand will increase, price levels will also start increasing like this. So we can expect a higher inflation rate in the system because of this. And second, we can also expect higher public debt, higher borrowings of the government. So generally these two will happen when government will also start spending more during the boom phase. So understand this, during boom already the expenditure is high. So government is also increasing its expenditure. Such a type of a policy, understand the logic here, such a type of a policy which will basically reinforce the cycle. I'll repeat the statement here. Such type of a policy where government will reinforce the cycle. What do you mean by cycle here? Either the boom phase or slowdown phase, recession or the recovery phase. So whenever government's policies will basically either intensify the boom or intensify slowdown or intensify recession or intensify recovery. So whenever these kind of policies are formulated by the government, such policies are referred as pro-cyclical policies. Is it okay? These are referred as pro-cyclical. Let me give you another example. Take the recessionary stage here. This is a recessionary stage. During recessionary stage, what will happen? The private sector investment is very low. What about the employment growth rate? Very low. Unemployment rate is increasing. So if government also reduces its expenditure, at this particular point of time, do you expect the Indian economy will recover? Have you understand the logic here? Somebody has to invest in the market. Somebody has to generate employment in the market. If government of India is not doing this, obviously private sector will also not do it. Let me explain the same concept using a formula here. Now, basic idea of a GDP can be measured in different ways. I'll use one methodology here. I hope remember this particular formula. GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And focus on three parameters here, C plus I plus G. In this particular formula, C stands for consumption expenditure of the households or expenditure of the households. I stands for investment from the private sector, and G stands for government expenditure. Now have a look at this. If GDP has to increase, these investments will have to increase. Overall investment in the economy has to increase. But at this particular point of time, at the point of recession, what do you think will be the investment expenditure of the companies? Do you think investment done by the companies will be very high or very low? Investment expenditure will be lower. What about the expenditure of the households? What do you think the households will do during recession? Right? For example, in recession, the households generally reserve their money. Follow the explanation very carefully here. During recession, the households generally reserve their money for consumption of essential goods and services. For example, food. Second, during recession, the household income is already being affected. Why? The unemployment rate starts increasing. The household's income earning will also come down. So have a look at this. On one side, their incomes are already affected, and on the other hand, their expenditure is concentrated towards or is directed towards the idea of a consumption of essential goods and services. So the private sector, which accounts around 28 to 29% of the total value here, is affected. The consumption expenditure of the households accounts for more than 50% of the total expenditure here. That is also very lesser. So of the three participants, private sector, it will say no, there is a problem with the GDP. Households, though they want to spend, they do not have, and even if they have, they will be concerned about their future. For example, during this particular time of a recession, imagine there is a household. Don't you think this particular household will be worried about whether the bread earner of the household will have a job after 1 month, 2 months, or after 3 months? Yes. So if there is a concern in this particular household, what do you think they will do with their expenditure? Reduce it or increase it? Obviously reduce it. So household expenditure lower, and please remember this, household expenditure accounts for more than 50% of this particular value of GDP here in this particular formula. The investment expenditure done by the company is 28 to 29%. Government, have a look at this. If households are not spending, companies are not spending, who has to spend in the market now? It is the government. The duty becomes of the government to spend more, to revive the economy, to revive demand for goods and services in the market. That is the precise reason. Understand this. During this particular phase of a recession, it is the duty of the government to spend more, to increase the expenditure, to generate demand, to generate employment. But if government doesn't do that, rather with decreasing private sector investment, if government's expenditure also comes down at this particular point of time, and the taxes increase at this particular point of time, this is again the example of the pro-cyclical policy. Is it okay? So understand the logic here. There are four stages. Let me put everything in a nutshell now. There are four stages. The four stages in the business cycle or economic cycle are: one, boom or expansion; second one is a slowdown; third one is a recession; and the fourth one is a recovery. And we have seen what will happen individually in all of these particular four stages. Now, if government policies intensify these particular stages, for example, there is a slowdown happening. If the policy of the government basically fasten this particular rate of a slowdown or speed up the rate of a slowdown, there is a recession. Government policies will again induce a higher recession in the economy. Generally, these kind of policies are called as pro-cyclical policies. And what about the other side? Exactly opposite to this is called as a counter-cyclical policies. Now, let's try and understand what is the importance of a counter-cyclical policy. But before that, what do you mean by the terms counter-cyclical policy? Follow this very carefully. Here, cyclical refers to the four stages in the business cycle. What are the stages? Again, repeat it so that you will remember it for a longer duration. One is a boom, second one is a slowdown, third one is a recession, and the fourth one is a recovery. Counter here means whatever is happening in the economy, whatever is actually taking place in the economy, the government's policies will basically try to negate it, will try to reduce the impact of this particular cycle. For example, have a look at this particular stage here. This is the recessionary stage. In the recessionary stage, what generally happens? We have already discussed this. During recessionary stage, private sector investment is lower. What about employment generation? Very, very low. Unemployment rate? Higher. Demand for goods and services? Lower. So these are certain outcomes or certain features of this particular recessionary stage. Now, if government policies are doing exactly opposite to this, if government's policies are doing exactly opposite to this, right? For example, government will increase its expenditure. Government will increase its expenditure. So private sector investment coming down, government's investment expenditure will increase. Government will create employment in the system. So earlier, without government intervention, what we have seen, unemployment rate increasing. Now government will jump into action, create employment opportunities. Government will also create a demand for goods and services. So have a look at this. Generally in the cycle, this is what we find. But because of the government policies, exactly opposite to this will start happening in this particular cycle or in this particular stage of the cycle. Such policy is called as a counter-cyclical policy. Let me give you this same idea of a counter-cyclical policy using with the stage of the boom or expansion. During boom, what will happen? During boom, private sector investment very high, employment generation very high, the demand for goods and services also very high. At this particular point of time, what is the idea of a counter-cyclical policy? Exactly opposite to what is happening. That is, government will reduce or control its expenditure. Government will control its expenditure. Government will increase the tax rates. Government will increase the tax rate. Government will reduce its expenditure. So basically, they are following a policy which is exactly opposite to what is happening at this particular stage in the cycle. If I put it in a simple term, whenever I say counter-cyclical policy, during boom, it will basically follow a contractionary fiscal policy. Is it okay? It is following a contractionary fiscal policy when there is a boom, and it is following an expansionary fiscal policy when there is a recession. You can read it in the other way. For example, under pro-cyclical policy, we have seen that when there is a boom, government follows an expansionary fiscal policy. When there is a recession, government is following a contractionary fiscal policy. This is a basic idea of a pro and counter cyclical policies. The same thing has been provided in this particular table. Now you'll have to understand this. So why government's policies are very important here. Right? I told you basically there are 4 stages. Understand this. If government doesn't intervene correctly at any of these particular stages, there is a danger that rather than having an economic cycle like this, the economic cycle will become like this. That is, when there is a boom, the intensity of a boom is very high, or the magnitude of the boom is very high. It will lead to higher inflation rate. It will basically lead to higher public debt. That is a precise reason at this particular point of time, that is, government rather than having an expansionary monetary policy, government should have a contraction monetary policy so that they will stabilize this particular economic cycle. And on the other hand, if government doesn't intervene at, let's say, the point of a recession or during the stage of recession, the recession may become much more severe. So the GDP growth rate in terms of a negative outcome will be much higher if government doesn't intervene. And again here, government needs to intervene, increase the expenditure, create employment so that they will again stabilize this particular business cycle. So understand the importance of the pro and counter cyclical. Generally, there is a business cycle. If government doesn't intervene, the booms and the bust or the booms and recessions will be very severe or very high intense. So government will intervene in the system and try to stabilize this particular the business cycle as such. So fiscal policy stance pro-cyclical, counter-cyclical, during recession, during expansion, and what is the outcome. Whatever we have discussed, that is basically given in the table form here. Have a look at this. For example, pro-cyclical, I've already told you. Pro-cyclical means what? During recession. During recession, they will have a basically contractionary fiscal policy, and during expansion, expansionary fiscal policy. That is, they are going to intensify whether there is a boom or whether there is a recession. So at this particular point of time, that is during recession, if I say pro-cyclical policy, government expenditure is expected to come down and the tax rates or tax collection is going to increase. And this will further make the recession much more severe. And during expansionary stage, the government expenditure increases and tax rates are cut. And what is the outcome of all of this? It will basically deepen the recession, amplifies the expansion, and thereby increasing the fluctuations in the business cycle. On the other hand, if government follows a counter-cyclical policy, during a recession, they will try to basically ensure that the GDP growth rate is revived, employment is generated, investment expenditure is increased. So they will basically follow expansionary fiscal policy, increased government expenditure and reduced taxes. And during expansion, they will ensure that there is not too much of an investment expenditure, which will basically lead to higher inflation, so on and so forth. So they will follow contractionary fiscal policy, reduce the government expenditure and increase the taxes. It will basically soften the recession, reduce the intensity of a recession and moderate the expansion, stabilize the cycle, thereby decreasing the fluctuations in the business cycle. So this is a basic application of a pro and a counter cyclical growth as such. Now understand this. Why should you study all of this? If you take the current economic survey, there has been a lot of discussion with respect to this particular idea of a pro and counter cyclical policies of the government. The current economic survey basically says that Government of India, many of the times the policies of the government are pro-cyclical in nature. I'll repeat the statement here. Many of the times the government policies have been found to be pro-cyclical, or else it will put in another way, very diplomatic way of the saying. And it says that at many points of time it has been found that the government policies are not counter-cyclical. Now, please understand this. Of the two, by now, I'm pretty sure you would have understood having a counter cyclical policy is a much better approach than having a pro cyclical policy. Because, in simple terms, pro cyclical will intensify the recession, intensify the boom, whereas counter cyclical will always have a moderating effect on both the boom as well as the recession. So, having a counter cyclical policy is a much better approach compared to pro cyclical policy. But the economic survey states that for majority period of the times it has been found that government of India's policy is not counter cyclical. So that has been one issue with respect to government policies. So government needs to ensure that whenever there is too much of a growth rate, it needs to moderate this particular growth. And whenever there's a slowdown and a recession, government needs to intervene and ensure that the growth or the demand will be revived in the market by following the idea of a counter cyclical fiscal policy.